going to do today, though, is we are going to learn a lot about Senate Bill 4D, which is the condo legislation law that is changing the way that most waterfront condos are going to operate going forward. By the estimates that I've seen, it affects over 2/3 of all waterfront condos in the state of Florida. So it's not something that's localized just to Sarasota and Manatee counties. Every county in the state of Florida is going through this. This is a direct result of the Surfside condo collapse, which happened in 2021. And I think it's a welcome change, but it's going to bring about some market conditions for us that are going to be a little bit different. And so I've asked very kindly has she agreed to come in and talk with us a little bit about what this legislation means. Natasha Selvaraj, everybody's favorite attorney from Berlin Patent Ebling, and I'll just turn the floor over to her, and this will help you do your power.
Perfect.
Okay.
That's going to be my question. Hi, everyone. So the handout that you have is going to just talk more about the market conditions and stuff like that. So we'll get to that, but I didn't want you to have to decipher all of the legislation. So you'll see when we start talking that I'm going to talk about all of the stuff that was effective July 1st, 2022. But we're really lucky and we will have fun legislation coming for July 1st, 2023. And I'll talk a little bit about that because that's brand new as of last week. So nothing is official yet, but it's coming, and I need to figure out how to use the clicker.
It's the up and down button.
Oh, perfect. Down. Okay. Obviously, we all know about Surfside and what happened down there, and essentially what came out of that was a lot of people saying, how can a building that so many people were living in collapse out of nowhere with no warning, which led to, well, maybe there were some warnings and we just ignored them. And if you've ever sold a condo, you probably know that most of the time, 99.9% of the time, unless your buyer's from New York, they only ever look at the inside of the condo because that's what they're buying, so that's what they're inspecting. You rarely, if ever, have anybody ask about the building as a whole because everybody's working under the assumption, and you know what they say about assumptions, working under the assumption that the building is fine and there's people living here, so surely if there was a problem, someone would tell me. It's sort of like, even with a single family home where people are like, well, if there was a significant issue, surely the seller knew and would tell me, and it would be on a seller disclosure or it would be obvious. And what we've learned is that's not necessarily the case. So as a result of that, the legislators throughout the state have decided that we're not really good at paying attention to these things and being responsible for our own high-rise buildings, and high-rise for their purposes 3 stories or more. So we need some rules, and we need to check in every certain period of years to make sure that things are still structurally sound and, you know, there's regular maintenance and upkeep. And we'll talk about a little bit of the issues behind that as well. So what we're essentially doing is we're introducing milestone inspections. So milestone inspections are going to be a true structural inspection of your condominium building, either every 30 or 25 years, originally based on the CO date, based on where the condo is located. So if it's within 3 miles of the coastline, it's every 25 years. If it's further than 3 miles, it's every 30 years. That's going to change because there's already legislation determining what coastline means, because some of us think of coastline as Siesta Key. Some people think of coastline as Manatee River. So they didn't really define a whole lot of things last year. They were like, here's a solution. And then as people have started implementing the solution, there's been a lot of questions like, well, when you mean coastline, do you truly mean coastline, or do you mean any body of water? Do you really just care about the salt water in, the ocean, or do you care about the rivers? Do you care that it's 3 stories in total? And are they habitable stories, or do you just care about the height of the building? So that's one of the changes that's coming. Right now it defines everything as a 3-story building, but it doesn't tell you if it means parking garage included or not. It also doesn't tell you if they're going by just height. So for example, the new legislation that they're proposing is going to have a height requirement, not a number of stories. So if the height of 3 stories per your building code, the minimum height of what 3 stories can be, then it would apply versus just 3 stories. So if you have older buildings with, low ceilings, maybe there's no change, you're still under your 3. But if you have higher ceilings, and maybe you're a 2-story building because someone decided instead of doing 9-foot ceilings, they were going to do 12 or 15 or whatever they decided to do. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'll be back after July 1st when we get those new rules to tell you more about that. And then after that initial 25 or 30-year inspection, they're going to do milestone inspections every 10 years. So as the building gets older, the requirements are a little more cumbersome, with the theory being your brand new building that your developer just constructed is up to current building code, hopefully. It's getting inspected and you have all of that information as of 2022, 2023, all those new buildings. So we're going to give them 25 to 30 years, and then after that it's going to be every 10 years. Probably see where we're going with the issues that we're going to have. Other thing is these milestone inspections are supposed to be completed by licensed engineers and architects. We'll talk about that when we talk about some of the issues this is going to present, but it's not just your HOA or condo board president walking around and going, that looks great. No, that's a little questionable. It's really going to be a more intensive report that people are going to have to rely on. And when we talk about the condo writer changes, you'll see that that's going to become a requirement as well. And then the other big thing, so the result of having to do all these inspections is it's great to know that there's things wrong, but what are we going to do about it? And that's your reserve account. So the other big change is associations are going to be required to maintain reserve accounts. So all of the big stuff that we now see as special assessments that we get to talk about, because they're like, oh, we didn't know we would need to replace a roof. We thought this roof was going to be irreplaceable or lost forever. Now they have to have reserves for all of the big things that we know are going to have to get done. So it's the big stuff you think about, like the foundation, roofs, windows, but it's also going to cover stuff like your pool resurfacing and things like that, because the way that it's currently set up is, or it used to be set up prior to last year's update, was the condo board got to decide what they would put in reserves and what they wouldn't. And as you can imagine, most people sell homes every 7 years, give or take, maybe faster. And so if you just put new windows on, I as a homeowner, I'm like, oh, I'm going to live here for the next 5 years. Why am I paying into windows that I'm never going to see the benefit of? So I'm going to vote no. We're not going to have reserves. I don't want to pay you an extra $500 a month and move on. Then your poor unsuspecting buyer buys it, and 3 days after closing, they're like, oh, by the way, we just decided that we're going to get new windows, so you're going to get a bill for $15,000. And your buyer's like, what? No one told me that. That was not part of my, plan when I bought this condo. So now the reserves are going to be built in, and they're not going to be things that you can opt out of. And I've had this happen so many times in the last couple of months because everybody's realizing that they do have to do this stuff. It's not just something that happened and they thought it was going to go away. So people are really starting to get the ball rolling on it because everybody has a deadline. Yes.
If they're going to do these special assessments to bring up to be a fully funded reserves, are those things that they're going to have a built-in time frame so they can phase them up, or is that going to be like you need to be filled by this for a certain time?
So that isn't specifically outlined in the legislation yet. So it gives the associations the ability to do that. Part of it's going to be depending on how old they are. So if you're 30 years old and you're going to have one of these milestone inspections, and your milestone inspection comes back with we need all of these repairs. They haven't really told you how long you have to actually make the repairs. So I'm hoping this year they're going to address that because that's going to impact whether you have the ability to say, okay, well, I'm going to start assessing people $500 a month for the next 10 years and then I can get them in. Or, oh no, we somehow have to fund, $1 million. Where are we going to get $1 million from? And part of the discussion I've heard from people is you'll see a lot of private financing where people come in and say, I know you guys need all of these things, so we'll hold, a balloon noted mortgage so you can start getting stuff done and pay us back, which I haven't seen yet, but that's a theory that some people have put out there where that might be a way that people try to rescue buildings. Yes.
I've heard too that they're going to require certain allocation, like certain amounts for certain, like if the roof has to have X amount of dollars in it for reserves, they can't take like for the front gate and then blend it into.
Yeah. So everything has to be earmarked. The association budgets will have to have line items, so there's going to be a section that says it's for reserves, and then within that it needs to be itemized. So you're going to have to estimate what the roof is going to cost to replace, and then how you're going to keep that fully funded. So if you say the useful life of a roof is 20 years, then you're going to take that cost divided by 20 years, divided by all of your people. We're going to be paying into that however you allocate in that particular association. and then make sure that that's how you'll determine that you're fully funded, that by the time that replacement year comes, you have the money. The issue we're gonna run into is all the older buildings where people have put it off for so long, where they don't have the time to start collecting now for a future problem. They already have the problem now. Same thing, you're just gonna see a lot of special assessments, so making sure you understand the condo rider and how you're addressing those. And if you're on the listing side, making sure your sellers are paying attention to all of the minutes, because that's another issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well, that we've seen.
Now, you mentioned this is it's probably going to be detailed out for new legislation that's coming, but it's the height. Right now, it's 3 stories or higher.
3 stories or higher.
Yeah. So this has nothing to do with any of these single-level condo complexes.
Single level, no, none of them will have the same kind of requirements. That could change. We don't know what's going to happen. If I were to guess, I would imagine that they will have rules across them for anything that an association's maintaining, because what you don't want to happen is for someone to then have their roof get blown off that the condo has to pay for. The condo doesn't have any money, and go like, well, you should have applied, these rules to everybody, because now we have no way to fix it. And and that might just be something that the market determines, where people are like, well, I don't want to take a risk and buy something that I know I'm not going to be protected against, because prior to all of this legislation, no one really thought about what the reserves were on their condos. Nobody really paid attention to, the long-term impacts. Everybody thought about, this is what I'm buying now, these are my costs when I'm buying now, and maybe someday I won't even own it anymore when that happens, so it wasn't really their problem. And now it's making everything everybody's problem now, and so people are just going to have to be a little more conscious about that.
So there's no current, or there was no current law for condos that have like reserves. They didn't
Reserves are
have to
optional.
have.
It was
Now, for the sake of financing, though, I remember some condo buildings, they did want to see reserves for the financing to actually take place. So it's this year.
Lenders care.
lenders care, and lenders have always
There's
cared
no law.
because
It's
no,
just
the
a
condo
lender.
statute gave you, as the association, gave the developer the option to fund or not fund reserves. And then when it got turned over to the association, they would then have the right to determine as the homeowners whether they wanted to fund reserves or not. Because the thought is, if you decide not to fund reserves, you're accepting that when the time comes, you're going to pay the bill. Your lender doesn't trust you to pay the bill because they're like, if I'm financing 97% of this purchase, I don't think that you have an extra $100,000, or I know you don't have an extra $100,000 to pay for a new roof when it gets damaged. So your lender wants to make sure that it's there, and that's part of their assessment when they're checking that you can afford it is, well, this is the money that they have, these are potential things that could go wrong, so that's part of their analysis. So for all of the buildings that were approved and you could get conventional loans on or FHA loans on, the couple of them that might exist, that was part of what the lenders were already looking at. But now they really want them to be for all buildings, not just for the lender's protection, but for the protection of the people who are living there. Who, I mean, look at the building in Miami, those people lost lives, homes, everything, and the lender doesn't really, like, getting the lender paid back their money is really like the lowest priority in all of that. It's, oh, well, we would have never thought to do that. And that's kind of what happens a lot of times with condos locally. People are like, well, the condo's approved by the lender. And it's like, yeah, but your lender cares about their investment being paid back, not necessarily you having, safe, secure place to live. So that's something to think about. We'll get into a little bit about how this impacts condo sales. I know we talked about it a little bit. Owning condos is going to become more expensive. We've talked about how with your smaller, older buildings, there are people who have lived in there for 20 or 30 years. They might be on fixed incomes. They might not have an extra $500 a month to pay for these upgrades, if you will. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you have areas that you farm that have those older buildings, this might be a good time before all hell breaks loose for your sellers to think about. Do they still want to live there? Do they want to live somewhere different? Do they want to sell when people are not super skeptical? Do they want to sell before their reserve study comes out? Because every building that's at that 25 or 30 year mark has until the end of 2024 to get their reserve study done and their milestone inspection. I don't know if I owned in a really old building, I would be selling now because I don't want to see the inspection and become responsible for the inspection results. I want to get out when people are still like, oh, we love condos, this has a great view, and not, oh, there's a looming $50,000 or $100,000 I have to pay. So, yes.
Are we obligated to disclose this potential new or this law that's going to be coming up as far as when people are selling or purchasing?
It's already added into your new condo rider that went effective March 20th. So there's an updated condo rider, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. It's also on your handout, and that added in the structural engineering report and also the milestone inspections and reserve study. So those are going to be required once they become available. Deadline is not till 2024 for people to complete them. So right now it's there, it's a box that you can check, but typically the associations don't have them, so there's nothing to provide. That's another question we get. What do those reports look like? No one's seen one yet, so we don't know. It could be a one-page summary that we can all decipher, or it could be 500 pages of engineering notes that are not going to mean anything to any one of us.
Is it in the 2024?
December 31st, 2024. Yes.
Does this make those engineering reports more available to us as realtors?
When they do, they're now required to be provided by the condo writer.
Currently?
Yes, as of March 20th.
Okay. It's like the 101, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
I've asked for that documentation for years.
Well, not all of, so they're going to have to provide, so this is everything, we'll go back. So they have to provide their structural and integrity reserve study and the inspection summary for their milestone summary. They don't have to provide like the turnover reports from when they last had.
Well, I'm specifically talking about the 101 because of all the things that happened there and then when they fixed it, the dolphin.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the engineering reports that I'm trying to get.
Those are not required by the condo writer.
Okay.
It's just the new documents that they should be preparing moving forward.
Thank you.
Other thing, obviously, we want to consider is buyers being aware that there are changes coming. I've had 3 buyers call me because they've closed on condos in the last couple of weeks, and now their associations are getting into the, hey, so we need to figure out how we're going to pay for this. So that's the other fun thing. Nobody has in their budget money to pay for these engineers and architects. Nobody, because nobody was expecting it until last year. So that's another expense. Even before they have confirmed anything has gone wrong or needs to be updated or upgraded, they have to come up with the money to pay for these actual inspections to be done, and not all associations have money. So right off the bat, that's an expense that a buyer who's buying between now and the end of next year is going to incur, because the report has to come from somewhere. And so you're just making sure your buyer knows that this is happening, because I looked at 3 people in the last week and I was like, well, you know, the legislation changed, and they're like, oh, it doesn't say that anywhere.
Is there a price point that they're seeing as assessment so far with this?
No one has assessed specifically for the reports yet, so it's hard to tell. I think it's also there's just gonna be a lot of variables. I think it's gonna be like a survey where it's how big is the building, how old is the building, do we expect that it really does have a lot of issues? Is it centrally located and we're just unfortunately old and we have to take a look at it? Who built the building? Are we concerned that this contractor who's no longer in business may have not done a great job? Is it someone local that we know who's still in business building buildings, and maybe the architect and engineer working on it are like, oh, we know the guy, like this is probably good work, we can do our inspection, or oh, we've had a lot of issues and so we don't know. So we haven't seen any estimations of what that's going to cost. We just know it's going to cost something, and most associations don't have that kind of wiggle room. The other thing someone pointed out that I hadn't thought about is we're going to have to pay someone to decipher those reports, because most boards don't have necessarily an engineer who's like, oh yeah, let me review that. They're probably going to need attorneys, because if I was on a board and not an attorney, I don't know that I would want the liability of deciphering a document and saying, oh yes, our building is great, because I don't want someone to call me when something happens and say, well, Natasha was on the board and she said that she reviewed the report and everything looked great. So those are just unexpected expenses buyers can expect. We just don't have the amounts. From the seller's perspective, disclosing any information they have is helpful. I have a lot of sellers who say, well, we didn't know the exact amount, so I didn't tell them it was coming. And I can appreciate that. But if you know that there is an assessment coming down the pipe, you just don't know what the number is, tell them, because then you don't have the issue of a buyer saying you knew and didn't disclose, because the last thing you want is for your transaction to fall apart at the closing table, as opposed to never going under contract because a buyer was never going to be willing to accept, the risk of not knowing what it's going to be. And part of that is, again, going back to the buyer, managing your buyer's expectation, because if they want a condo, there's going to be an assessment. Unfortunately, we just don't know what it's going to be, when it's going to show up, but it's just something that they're going to have to plan for. Talked about the reserve accounts. Going to the rider. So the rider got updated on March 20th. This part didn't change, so this is just checking if your buyer needs to be approved or not. It still gets missed all the time, so I just wanted to pause quickly to remind you to make sure that if you have the seller, they figure out the answer, and if you have the buyer, if there is an application required, that they work on that so that we can actually get to closing. Right of first refusal, we still don't see a whole lot of associations exercising that, but some of them do, in theory, have the right to buy the unit if they wanted to. Again, associations don't have a lot of money, so I really don't think they're going to be buying up units anytime soon. But you could have a developer on a board who decides, you know what, I'm going to buy up all of the units because I want to tear down this old building, avoid all these assessments, build something new, or whatever their plans might be. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then this is what we were talking about, the changes to the rider. So you'll see in blue is everything that they added, essentially providing that the seller has to provide milestone inspection reports and the structural integrity reserve study, but only if they're available. So again, no one's really done them yet, but as they start getting done, that's going to be part of what you need to provide.
So a new construction is going to already incorporate this into it, essentially?
Well, new construction already has to provide at turnover all of the documents to the association, so they'll provide that. And then the debate is, do you buy new construction now because at least you know it's new and it meets the requirements, and how does that impact resale? So that's, again, something to think about. With the new construction, you know you have 25 to 30 years before there's going to be any of these additional studies, so maybe it's a little more expensive, but maybe it gives you a little
Maybe
more.
it's not.
And maybe it's not.
And then you have a CDD anyways.
Yeah, so it's,
You're going to spend money no matter what.
yeah, so that's just where the requirement is. You'll probably see a lot more buyers, especially out-of-state buyers, asking for those documents, and they get frustrated when I tell them that they don't have to provide them yet because they most likely don't exist yet because nobody's gotten that far. But people are understandably freaked out about buying condos, and it's just managing those expectations. And then this is a special assessment section. So again, making sure if the seller is aware of any special assessments that they disclose them. If there are just notes that they can share, that works too, because then the buyer can't come back and say, well, you never told me. What's happening a lot, again, with our 30-day closing timeframes is if you have a meeting before you went under contract, it might have been a general discussion item, but then you're having the next meeting a day or two after you close, and they're like, this is approved, and then your buyer feels like you should have warned them that it was coming. And again, on the buyer side, they're supposed to be getting copies of documents, which...
Is there was discussion, I think, at the state level of putting all this stuff like a public, almost like a public website where a lot of these documents would be accessible. Is that happening, do you know?
I have not seen that yet.
That would be nice.
It would be, well, theoretically everything's in the public records. So I don't know that anybody is going to volunteer to take things out of the public records and maintain them on another website, because then you run into liability issues of, oh, I didn't put something in there, and then who do you blame when it's like, oh, well, I didn't know, but whoever the person is maintaining that didn't upload the 27th Amendment to this condo that changed your pet restrictions, and now someone's really mad because their dogs can't live there, but they already closed. It's like, oh. So I don't. It might be something that associations do, and maybe we'll see more associations maintaining their own websites, like, keeping them updated, so it's not like the last meeting minutes were from like 2007, but I don't want to get my hopes up.
That would be lovely.
I went to look for an association yesterday, and the only phone number I could find was from 2007, which was fine. I was like, maybe they haven't moved. Call the number, it's somebody's home phone. Like this little old lady answered the phone and was like, I don't know why people keep calling here. I was like, oh, this is listed as a condo association number on the interweb, so I apologize, but you'll probably get a lot of phone calls. So,
On the line.
same thing here. If possible, check the box that the buyer will pay installments due after closing, so that way there's no confusion. Because sometimes when closing gets delayed, this typically happens when closing gets pushed out. Closing gets pushed out, and then technically an assessment is due before closing because you moved the day out, and then you have the seller box checked, and then the seller's like, well, I didn't agree to pay for that. It's like, well, the assessment was due on June 1st, and you were supposed to close on May 25th. Then you moved your closing to June 25th, and so technically now it's due before closing, and nobody thought about that. So, yeah.
Oopsies.
So we're, again, talking about non-developer disclosure. So those are all of the documents that need to be provided. I am seeing a lot of buyers try to get out of their contracts because one of those documents wasn't provided. So if you have the seller, make sure you send all of them. The most recent version of all of them, I had someone who sent financials from 2015 and was like, I don't understand what more you want. It's like 2023, please. A lot of things change from year to year, let alone from 2015 to now. So just keep that in mind. The other thing is, again, going back to where we can find things, the association is going to be, unfortunately, the most reliable source for these documents. And unfortunately, some of them charge for them. I had someone tell a seller that they could pick up documents for $25, or we could order the electronic versions for $170. And I was like, why would anyone pick the $170 option? Just give me the paper and I'll scan it. But if you're not local and you don't have the option, you're going to get that upcharge. So just something for them to think about. And if they want to, if you're going to post them in the listing or provide them electronically to people making offers, then you might want the electronic version so you're not, handing out your paper copies and having to fight people to get them back. Buyers have 3 days to review all documents and can cancel. That's the main reason you as a listing agent want to make sure they have all the documents. I've got 2 buyers out of contracts because they didn't have updated documents. It's not great for the seller because in both those cases we were a week away from closing and we had asked for the documents multiple times and the listing agent never provided them. We even took it a step further because buyers really didn't want to cancel. They just wanted to be able to review the documents and mainly the rules. And when we finally got the rules, they were like, oh, well, we can't have our pets, we can't have our truck.
Time out. Listing people, did you guys hear how we can beat everyone else? Showing up to a listing appointment with those documents in hand, saying, I want to make sure we have these available to scan. Just, do you have anything that's more updated? It could just show that next level for us.
And that's going to make such a big difference because everybody's least favorite question is when I'm like, hey, do you have these documents? And I'm like, no. Or they're like, yes, this is what we received when we closed, and they forward me an email from like 10 years ago. I'm like, well, thank you, but I don't know if this will work. So just something to keep in mind. Or, when people are thinking about selling, reminding them to keep anything that comes from the association, even if they usually think it's junk, because that might have something in it that's
You had mentioned, so I'm looking through the new condo writer that we have attached, and it talks about the milestone inspection and the structural integrity report, and it says that those are required documents, which we've been discussing that those are required documents, but if they don't exist and we don't have the physical ability to deliver because they don't exist yet, how does that affect existing contracts?
So I believe that it says if available, or at least the original draft said if available. It says, if applicable, and the summary has been submitted to the association for the milestone inspection. And then for 10C, which is the structural integrity, if you don't have the study, you can provide a statement from the association showing that it hasn't been completed.
Okay, that's the part, I'm missing the part where it says, if it's available.
Yeah, what is that?
I see on TC, but where's the other one?
Right there. And the summary has
Florida
been,
statutes, if one applicable.
if one
Yeah.
applicable,
Oh,
and
and
the
two.
summary has been submitted to the association.
Okay.
So if it's not, then you don't have to. And then for 10C, it says, or a statement that the association
So
has.
we need a statement from the association
Yep,
that they have
and
not
that's
completed that
another way
integrity
to
report.
get ahead is if you have those statements on file for the communities that you work in, you can say, hey, so we already have this. We know that you don't have it, so you can disregard this requirement.
How long does the association have to get this done now?
Until the end of next year.
2024. So I think that your smaller associations are going to start this process after they see bigger local associations do it. One, so they have an idea of cost, because I can't imagine what it's going to be like to walk into a meeting and tell homeowners that they're going to have to pay some amount of money for something that we don't even know what it looks like yet. And we're not really 100% sure who's going to do it, because we don't even know who locally can complete it. And if you think about it, about a survey company, we know that, there are surveyors locally that we can use, and they generally know what their capacity is. They can do X number of surveys per month, and so, you can ask them for a quote. I don't know how people are going to quote doing this work, because there's nothing that they can look up online that tells you the answer. They can tell you what year it was built, and maybe the older buildings take a little more work. Maybe there's stuff they can look at. And I'm sure they're much smarter than I am, so they can probably figure it out, but it really doesn't look like they have a whole lot to go on to even provide a quote. And I know we've all tried to get contractors probably for something in the last year, and we've seen how that's gone. There's people building things, so I imagine our engineers and architects are pretty busy too. So being able to fit in a project like this is probably also going to be a challenge. So I think it's going to be a rush to that deadline. I don't know if they're going to have a mechanism to extend it, because I know Alex mentioned that 2/3 of the condos in the state are probably impacted. I can't think of a single thing that has had to happen statewide to 2/3 of anything that has happened timely. So I just don't know that we have the resources to do that, but I think it's going to start with the bigger associations, and then the smaller ones will probably be able to skate by for a little bit while they try to get that extended. They might just have to do a blanket extension for everybody to make sure that people can continue to buy and sell in those units, because you'll have the issue where when we get close to next November, and if someone doesn't have it, it's, well, I don't want to buy in that building because they're the only one who hasn't done it, or I don't want to run the risk of a fine or whatever else. So that's important to consider as well. We're in July 1st, when we get the new update, because it's constantly changing, we'll do another update. We usually do a blog post on it the day that it comes out, so keep an eye out for that. But we can do another class to talk about the changes. But the big ones I talked about were, instead of doing 3 stories, they're thinking of amending it to the height of 3 stories, so it would be regardless of how many stories are actually in the building, and then defining what the coastline is. Is it just any waterway? Is it just, the bay and the Gulf of the ocean? So,
and they're probably going to at least consider the intercoastal in most of the state, because we have one in most of the state.
Yeah, so we'll probably get some updates from that. New construction, just general information. People are going to continue to do reservation programs. You'll still see the same typical deposits for the new construction, and with the new construction contracts, there's a 15-day rescission period, so that's really your condo buyer's inspection period of all of the documents. Obviously, there's no building yet to inspect, but at least at the beginning, that's when they can do a lot of that. I always recommend having an attorney for them, because they're going to be reviewing budgets as part of that condo document review, and we're going to have a lot of developers who are not happy, or we already have a lot of developers who are not happy about having to have reserves, because most developers don't plan to have reserves. They plan to have this nice pretty building with the lowest amount of dues possible to help you sell condos, because nobody wants to pay $4,500 a month, and then you buy in the unit and then you turn over, and then it's like, oh yeah, we do need some reserves and we need to do all these other things. So that's changed. So you'll see some changes in how new condo developers are presenting their budgets as well. I'm waiting personally on a couple updated budgets from our clients, so that'll be fun. Just some general tips. I know you know probably this. Litigation is one that I point out, another way to set yourself apart, because we have a lot of buildings with a lot of litigation. I imagine we'll continue to have that as people get upset about their special assessments, and as people start to wonder about who's responsible for certain things that should have been done before and didn't get done. I talked to a group who really wanted to talk about board member liability, and how are we ever going to get anybody to sit on a board if boards are now going to be responsible for all of this stuff. and then you're going to come back and say, oh, well, why did you make an opinion about that? You're not an engineer. Or, hey, I need you to make a statement about this. And it's like, well, I'm not an engineer. I can't do that. Or I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you legally what could happen. So that's something that I think will change as well, which will be interesting. But we'll keep you posted as we hear more stuff on that. That's everything that I had. I'm sure you guys have questions because that was a lot of information. So open to questions, concerns. Yes.
So it's within 3 miles. I know we're doing a rough estimate of coastline at this point. I mean, it's pretty safe to assume the coastal construction control line is a good place to start measuring from for now.
That's a good spot.
Yeah, I mean,
but we have rivers.
I know we have rivers and we have other things that this is going to affect, but as far as the condo is concerned, like, that's Beneva Road. And those people aren't thinking about this. The people that live there aren't thinking about their condo association as a condo that's going to be affected by this.
Well, and it's that because your concept of that measurement, a lot of people are like, oh no, it's the people on Siesta Key, it's not me.
Right.
And it's like, no, it's kind of you. It's also people picturing tall buildings like Surfside where you're like, yes, I see how something could go wrong. Not their 3-story condo on Beneva where they're like, I'm like very safe here, like not a tall building, it seems sturdy enough, but you're not thinking about it. And it's intentionally broad because I think that they wanted to cover as much as they can, but it's also something that a lot of people are just going to assume doesn't apply to them because they haven't looked at a map. I mean, I'll be honest, I forget how close I am to the coast until it's hurricane season and someone's like, oh, well, don't forget to check your evacuation zone. And it's like, no, I'm sure I'm fine. And I'm like, oh, no, I am really close to the water. A lot of Sarasota is really close to the water, so we don't think about it. It's kind of all relative. You know that the people on Siesta Key are really close to the water. So if you're far, whatever your definition of far is, away from them, then you don't think that you're close to the water. But if you talk to someone in Tennessee, they're like, yeah, you're all close to the water. I don't understand how you think that, like, this is basically all about to be waterfront. So it's making sure people are educated and being able to point them to this stuff so it's not you scaring them because nobody wants to feel like you walked into their home to try to sell their home and you're like, well, this is going to be terrible for you. It really sucks that you bought a condo, you should have bought a single family home. But since you're here, we want to be able to say these are the rules. The nice thing is it applies to everybody, so it's not like they're picking on, one area or one county, or someone's going to say, well, this is just Sarasota and Manatee, so I'm going to go south or north. It's really everybody. So for what it's worth, it's a uniform rule and requirement. So no one seller is being penalized. It's unfortunately just something that we have to navigate for everybody.
So I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here as well. Is that you're going to see things that are affected at a lot of the bigger complexes, and I think the bigger complexes, just because of scale of economy, they're going to have bigger expenses overall that spread amongst more people. But you're going to see a big impact on smaller to medium size that do also fit this profile condo complexes. And one thing that you can be sure of is that most of those condos, most of them are going to be structurally okay, and I expect that we're going to come back with a lot of good reports that don't require a whole lot of repairs or minimal repairs. Certainly there will be some that they're like, wow, we totally dodged a bullet there. The bigger deal, though, is that these reserves are going to affect an enormous amount of people because a lot of buildings, a lot of them choose to keep their reserves low, and they do repairs by assessment. And anytime that you do repairs by assessment, you have to go back to your people over and over and over again. Those are going to be, every time you have to go back in front and get your population, your residents, and to get your board to vote in favor of these assessments, those are things that are going to be kind of tricky for them to be able to do. Those ones that don't have the reserves, those are 3/4 of waterfront condos. Those are the ones that are going to be the most heavily affected by this. Repairs or not, the assessments are going to hit.
Do we know any indication of what the penalty might be if they don't do these assessments or anything, and they just don't have the capital to actually do it? Do we know what they're going to?
It doesn't specify yet, but I've heard from some people that it might come to the point where they condemn buildings because if you can't prove that you're structurally sound and safe, they'll condemn your building. It's happened in Miami. There are buildings that are condemned because they started doing their studies and reports, and those buildings truly probably people shouldn't live in, but then you have people who are like, well, was condemned. The only home that I've ever had. It's, probably somewhere that they've lived for
It's not
20 or 30
worthless.
years. It's not worth the repairs the way that it is, and there's going to be a developer who's going to swoop in and go, "This is great, $200,000 a pop." I couldn't buy the land for that 5 years ago, or at the height of COVID. So we'll demolish and we'll rebuild. We'll solve your problem, and you might have homeowners who are like, "Well, at least I'll get something, and I can move somewhere else." The problem is everybody's problem where do you move? And so we don't know whether there's going to be some type of sweeping other legislation that comes in to say, well, if you have, I can't even think of what those rules are going to be, but if you have maybe less than so many units, you get more time, or maybe if you have minor issues, I don't know who's going to define what minor issues are, then maybe we give you a little more time. Maybe there's going to be funding available for buildings that can't raise the capital. Maybe it's going to be if your entire cost of repairs exceeds $1 million, and we have this pool that you can draw from and then pay us back. Nobody has gotten there yet, and so nobody knows. I think everybody's still waiting to see if they'll make enough changes this year that it'll make it easier to comply with, because right now it's just this scary, let's get all of these reports and then maybe have to fix things, but again, it's the unknown. We don't know what the reports are going to cost. We don't know who's going to do them. We don't know what they're going to look like. We don't know what they're going to tell us we have to fix and what that's going to cost.
So we're seeing uncertainty, probably definitely into maybe early 2025 with all that.
Yeah, I would say at least mid-summer next year, because I think we'll get this update in July, and then there might be a rush for another update next July before the deadline. And then from there we'll see what they can figure out. But I think it's a lot of people having conversations like this where we're like, oh yeah, we really do need to know that. And then going back to the people who get to decide what to do, we're like, hey, we have all these problems. And we're like, oh yeah, that's a good point. We never really thought about that. We should fit that in here somewhere. And amending.
Do you think they chose 3 miles as kind of a broad picture and then maybe scale it back to closer
No.
to
I don't think it's going to go closer. I
Fort
think
Myers
it'll-
got leveled 5 miles inland, and that's probably factored into this as well.
Yeah, I imagine if anything, it'll go up to 5, not
Yeah.
down less than 3.
And nobody wants a repeat of certified.
True.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what
This is trying to prevent that as
sell
much
to
as
people
possible.
is we're going to cover as many people as we possibly can, and a big part of Surfside is the argument that a lot of it was corrosion from the seawater, and of course the salt water rather, and it's hard to tell people. I mean, I guess I don't know enough about it to distinguish between 3 miles and 5 miles and say, oh yeah, mile 4 and 5 are so much safer than mile 3, but they have to draw a line somewhere, and I'm assuming they drew it across the state and tried to cover the most number of homes that they could. And there's nothing that prevents other condos from doing the same. I mean, I've heard from condo boards who are like, well, it doesn't really apply to us, but I don't want to be the board that didn't do something that everybody else was doing, and then something happened to the building, and then it's my fault because we all knew that something like this was possible, but I didn't bother to say, hey, we should do that. So I don't know if it's just to at least say on paper, hey, we considered it. Every single person in the room said, absolutely not. I don't want to pay for the study, and then we moved on. But you might see other associations also at least put it out there because they don't want, again, and from a resale perspective, if you're at mile 3.2 and someone's at 2.9 and this building on 2.9 is getting all of these studies, you might not want to buy that building less than, a mile away that's like, oh yeah, well, it doesn't apply, so we actually don't know. Our building's just as old, built by the same people, but like,
Looks good.
yeah, it looks fine. Yeah, it's across the street. Like, we'll be fine here.
There's
So
certain people do that much research, but okay.
So
I have a lot of faith in people reading, and I know I shouldn't, but I holding on to it.
I mean, this opens up a huge opportunity in Orlando, I see, for the people that can't afford this condo but like condo lifestyle. Because Orlando's not going to have any of this. At all. They're not going to be assessed in any of their condo associations to do any of this at all because they're not anywhere near the coast, even though they're the sinkhole swamp capital of Florida. But
Yeah.
I see people flocking to that because of it and the opportunities that Orlando affords.
you also have like all these buildings that are going to require reserves should open up financing opportunities for all of those as well, where there should be financeable buildings at some point if they're
Because they're actually somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. It might also just depend on whether lenders are going to want to see those studies before they do that, because if I was the bank, I'd be like, oh, you didn't do this before, and all of a sudden you're collecting a lot of money. That seems a little suspect. Like, what's in your report that prompted you to do that? So, again, I don't know that every lender is going to be like as skeptical as I am about everything. So, it's possible. It should be, but.
It was a real eureka moment for me here that when we started talking about the fact that it's not just the waterfront, that it is the 3 miles inland. And we've talked a lot about this, about the fact that this is waterfront, that is the way that this has been come down. It's been presented a lot of the time to Realtors. But there are definitely, just as you go up and down Tuttle Road, right, Clark Road, you're going to see 5 different condos right there that are absolutely affected by that.
All of Gulf Gate.
And those are going to be older buildings that definitely fit the profile for what will be required here. And in places where a lot of the residents might not even have the income to come up with those assessments, it's just a different income in a lot of those different buildings. And so that's something as we're looking through this, don't think of this just as waterfront, but look at the new disclosures that are required all around with condominium.
And how would that work? Because you just said you brought up Gulf Gate Apartments, so like if that's a non-owner, it's just apartments that's just managed and owned by whatever company. Are they affected because it's a condo rule, or is it just any building?
It's a condo.
So apartments would be exempt.
Condominiums. Apartments will fall under commercial rules, and I'm sure that those will follow. But people, I think, are less concerned by the apartments because theoretically, the owner is going to upkeep the building in order to entice people to live there, because, or not so much in Sarasota.
Is there any commercial right now? Anything like this in commercial?
No.
So I mean, you see that just last week in New York, the garage fell through. Like, there's no follow up or no milestone inspections on anything like commercial?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Well, the thought process with commercial is a majority of your commercial tenants, in theory, are choosing to be somewhere versus somewhere else. And if you're paying rent, theoretically, you can afford to pay rent somewhere else. It doesn't work everywhere. And the thought is that you, as a commercial tenant, have more bargaining power than a condo owner who's like, well, I can't just say, well, I'm not going to live here anymore and go somewhere else because I might not be able to actually go anywhere else.
What about places like Treasure Island, where all of those condos are hotels?
Depends how they were set up. If they were set up as actual condos under a condo declaration and statute 718, then it would apply.
Otherwise, they're commercial.
Otherwise, they're commercial.
Oh, I wonder what that does to the timeshares that are condos.
I think that they would still count as condos and this would still apply to them.
I thought you had a bad trying to get a timeshares now.
It's funny, I say that. I was like, 2 people asked about timeshare needs yesterday, and I thought it was odd because we usually get like one every 6 months, but maybe they figured it out. Yeah, now's the time to try. And that's the hard part, is like, is it now? Is it next year? And it's going to depend on the person and their risk tolerance, which is kind of the same as everything else, and what they're willing to.
Yeah, but we need to have a model for what this is going to cost you.
And I think, and that's what's really hard for to explain to people is, hey, you need these studies that nobody's ever done before, but I can't tell you what they're going to cost. I can tell you how long they're going to take. I'm not even, like, you can't really Google someone and say, who's doing them that I call? So it's still such a work in progress that it's a lot of uncertainty, but.
Who wants to open up a condo assessment?
Yeah.
Right? To need an
Structural
engineer.
engineers.
I know a couple.
Go back to school real quick. Learn something
I just
new.
manage some people.
We have other questions for Natasha, guys? And Natasha, you were excellent. Thank you very much. I have a full page of notes, plus you sent me the slides, so I'm going to go back and look at your slides. Skip past you here.
And we have it on video.
And we have it on video, so we'll post this online. We will send this off to any Pleadings team up in Reddington Beach. I thank you guys for coming in. Natasha, as always, you're excellent. You're super excellent. So thanks for coming to NextHome Excellence.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for talking.
She didn't know what a boom is.
She doesn't.
She doesn't know.
It's good.
It's a good thing you want a boom. All right, thanks guys. Y'all have a wonderful day. Please eat an apple spice on your way out the door because we have a couple extra apple spices, and also that's always a good choice. Thank you so much.
They're my favorite. Like, go to, like, box lunch.
All right,
Delicious.
thanks guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tasha.
Oh, good to see you guys.
Always.
I have more questions and answers at this point.
July 1st would be good.
Do you turn off the camera?
This would be like what you have to like, I don't know.
Yeah, like
Basic
stuff
elementary.
is happening.
Yeah.
And then there'll be